Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 13. I'm going to continue on with the kingship of Samuel. Now, one of the things we're going to get into is Samuel's first failure, which is kind of interesting. I'll let the scriptures unfold itself, but Samuel is going to fail. Now, what this will show is what really is in his character. And so I'm going to highlight some things from this when we, as we move along in these next few chapters, because they will be quite revealing. So we're going to start off with not so bad to very bad. In other words, but understand that this was always his character. So when the Bible says that God, man looks on the outside, but God sees the heart, we're going to have a kind of a bird's eye view from God's perspective on Saul's heart, which is wicked. All right. So chapter 13, 1 Samuel chapter 13. It says, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. Now, the age 30, it's kind of a significant age. One, it sort of signifies manhood. David himself will become king at 30. Jesus will enter his ministry at 30. Particularly priests would enter the priesthood at 30. So it's kind of significant. The age 30 here is significant. Now he tells us that he reigned for 42 years. So just keep this in mind, just as a matter of Bible study. Remember, we're getting snapshots of this 42 years. So it's not in exact chronological order, okay, but we get snapshots. We're getting what God, through the Holy Spirit, through the writer, is giving us the important thing that He wants us to know. Verse 2: He chose 3,000 men from Israel for himself. Now you remember, Samuel told them this is what the king will do. He will take your sons and put them into his service. It says 2,000 were with Saul at Mishmash and in Bethel's hill country, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And he sent the rest of the troops away, each to his own tent. Now we're introduced to Saul's son, Jonathan, and we will become more acquainted with him later, as he would become one of David's best friends. But right now we're introduced as his son. Now, what is interesting about Jonathan is, I'm going to say poor Jonathan. He's just wrong family, wrong time. And you will see why I say that as we move on. Jonathan is the presumptive heir apparent, but that will not be God's plans for his life. And what is interesting about this is that Jonathan will also realize this. Jonathan will realize what God's plans are. And in some respects, as we are told the story, Jonathan is kind of the victim of his circumstances. And we'll see that later. Verse 3. Jonathan attacked the Philistine garrison and was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all the Israelites heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine garrison, and Israel is now repulsive to the Philistines. Then the troops were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Okay. The Philistines also gathered to fight against Israel. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So this huge army. Then they went they went up and camped at Mishmash, east of Haven, I should say. The men of Israel saw that they were in trouble because the troops were in a difficult situation. They hid in caves, thickets, among the rocks and holes and cisterns. Now, remember that, file that in your mind for when you read Hebrews chapter 11, accounting of some of the Israelites in that faith chapter. Verse 7, some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad, and Gilead. Saul, however, was still at Gilgal, and all the troops were gripped with fear. He waited 7 days for the appointed time that Samuel had set. Now, this is important right here, because here we're going to see a turning point. Now, the information we have here is Samuel had told him as prophet to wait 7 days. So look at verse 8 again. He waited 7 days for the appointed time that Samuel had sent, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the troops were deserting him. So Saul said, bring me a burnt offering and a fellowship offering, and then he offered the burnt offering. Now, one of the interesting things about these scriptures is that as they're telling the event, it's like watching a movie. And okay. But first, here is Saul's sin. First and foremost, when the troops are deserting him, they're in fear. And then on top of that, you have this vast army that is planning an attack. So here's the problem with Saul. He decides he's going to offer a burnt offering. Why would he do that? So even if he said, okay, we don't know what happened to Samuel, why wouldn't he ask God? Why wouldn't he call for a priest at the very least? There's a pattern right here that we're going to see with Saul, is how he takes things into his own hands in a rebellious, sinful way. Okay? Verse 10, just as he finished offering the burnt offerings, Samuel arrived. That's why I say it's almost like watching a movie. So had he just waited a little time, Samuel would have showed up. Right? But that's not the point. He wasn't supposed to offer the offering anyway. But anyway, just as he finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. So Saul went out to greet him. And Samuel asked him, what have you done? Samuel answered, when I saw that the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were gathering at Mishmash, I thought the Philistines would now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor. Now, that's a misnomer. He was taking things in his own hands. He wasn't looking at the Lord. So I forced myself to offer the burnt offerings. Yeah, we're going to see this too, how this exaggeration right here. I mean, I had no choice. I forced myself. So, verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, you have been foolish. You have not kept the commands which the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel. But now your reign would not endure. The Lord has found a man loyal to him, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not done what the Lord commanded. Wow, right? Because remember, at this time, David is a little boy. So one of the interesting things about this is the harshness, and we're going to see this later. God will even say himself, the harshness against Saul. Verse 15. Then Samuel went from Gilgad to Gibeah in Benjamin. Saul registered the troops who were with him, about 600 men. Saul, his son Jonathan, the troops who were with him were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the Philistines were camped at Mishmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camps in 3 divisions. One division headed towards Ophrah road, the Ophrah road leading to the land of Shaul. The next division headed towards Beth Horon road, the Beth Horon road, and the last division headed down the border road and looked over the valley of Zebulun towards the wilderness. No blacksmiths could be found in all of Israel because the Philistines had said otherwise. The Hebrews would make swords and spears, so all the Israelites went to the Philistines to sharpen their plows and mattocks, axes, and sickles. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for a plow and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for pitchforks and axes for putting points on the ox goad. So on the day of the battle, not a sword or spear could be found in the hand of any of the troops who were with Saul, and Jonathan only Saul and his son Jonathan had weapons. Now the Philistines' garrison took control of the pass at Mishpah. Now, this is kind of a sad thing here that, as it said, Saul's sin. Now, what's interesting about this, we'll come back to this later, God's harshness towards Saul. In God's eyes, remember, we are only owed judgment. In other words, God is never obligated for mercy. And so God is showing through Saul, he's not obligated for mercy. In other words, he could have had mercy. He's going to have mercy on David, but he is never, though, obligated for mercy. And he's going to decide not to have mercy on Saul, in that he's taking the kingdom away from him. Verse 1. The same day, Saul's son Jonathan said to the attendant who carried his weapons, "Come on, let us cross over to the Philistine garrison to the other side." However, he did not tell his father. Saul was staying under the pomegranate tree in Magwan, on the outskirts of Gibeah. The troops with him numbered about 600. And Ajahai, who was wearing the ephod, was also there, and his son Ahitub, the brother of Ichabod, the son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shalom. Now remember, Ichabod, he was born years ago, right? So he's probably in his 20s about now, but he was born years ago when God judged Eli, which would have been his grandfather. And as his mother was dying in childbirth, that's why she named him Ichabod, okay? Because she said the glory had departed. Verse 3 again, Ahijah, who was wearing the ephod, was also there. He was the son of Ahitub, the brother of Ichabod, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest at Shiloh. But the troops did not know that Jonathan had left. And there were sharp columns of rocks on both sides of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine garrison. One was named Bozi, and the other one was Sini. One stood to the north in the front of Mishmash, and the other to the south of Gibeah. Jonathan said to his attendants who carried the weapons, "Come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will help us. Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Now, this is an awesome perspective by Jonathan, right? His armor bearer responded, "Do what is in your heart. You choose. I am here with you, whatever you decide." All right. Jonathan replied, "We'll cross over to the men and let them see us. If they say, 'Wait until we reach you,' then we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up,' then we will go up, because the Lord has handed them over to us. This would be our signs." Now, let me just say this. Normally, you would probably say that signs, it's not wise for you to start making signs that the Lord has not given you. Okay? In other words, I wouldn't advise you to do that. And just keep this in mind. Jonathan didn't know. They were doing it by chance. And it just so happened God was behind it. Verse 11, they let themselves be seen by the Philistine garrison, and the Philistines said, "Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've been hiding." The men of the garrisons called to Jonathan and to his armor bearer. "Come up here and we will teach you a lesson," they said. "Follow me," Jonathan told his armor bearer, "for the Lord has handed them over to Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor bearer behind him, and Jonathan cut them down, and his armor bearer followed and finished them off. In that first assault, Jonathan and his armor bearer struck down about 20 men in a half-acre field. Terror spread through the Philistine camp, and the open field saw all the troops. Even the garrison and the raiding parties were terrified. The earth shook, and terror spread from God. Now, they didn't know that. They just saw that all this loud noise and the shaking of the earth was happening. When Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and they saw the panicking troops scattered in every direction. So Saul said to the troops with him, "Call a roll and determine who has left us." And they called the roll and saw that Jonathan and his armor bearer were gone. Saul told Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God," for it was with the Israelites at that time. While Saul spoke to the priests, the panic in the Philistine camps increased in intensity. So Saul said to the priests, "Stop what you are doing." Saul and all the troops with him assembled and marched to battle, and there the Philistines were fighting against each other in great confusion. Now, this is kind of interesting that you see this, that God had caused this confusion among the Philistines. So much so that they were fighting each other, killing each other off. Okay? Verse 21, there were the Hebrews from the area had gone earlier into the camp and joined the Philistines, but even they joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And when all of the Israelites, men who had been hiding in the hill country of Ephraim, heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they also joined Saul and Jonathan in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day. The battle extended beyond Beth-Haven, and the men of Israel were worn out that day, for Saul had placed the troops under an oath that the man who eats food before evening, before I've taken vengeance on my enemies, is cursed. So none of the troops tasted any food. So again, a very foolish, command of Saul. It was just foolish. And again, we're going to see this with Saul now. Saul is the type of person that God is just like, yuck. Okay. All right, verse 25. Everyone went into the forest, and there was honey on the ground. When the troops entered the forest, they saw a flow of honey, but none of them ate any of it because they feared the oath. However, Jonathan had not heard his father make the troops swear the oath. He reached out with the end of his staff he was carrying and dipped it into the honeycomb, and when he ate it, he had renewed energy. Then one of the troops said, "Your father made the troops solemnly swear that the man who eats food today is cursed, and the troops are exhausted. Jonathan replied, my father has brought trouble into the land. Just look at how I renewed energy because I taste a little honey. How much better if the truth had eaten freely today from the plunder they took from their enemies than the slaughter of the Philistines would have been much greater. Now, this kind of shows us, and let me just do a quick sidebar here, how foolish leadership can be, and then how it can cost nations, how it can cost things. We just got rid of one of our foolish leaders, and I don't know if we've gained another foolish leader, but it just kind of shows you here that here was Saul, who should have been seeking God, and this is Saul's problem, that he's making all these decisions because he is not seeking God. And so Jonathan is right. How much better would the battle would have been had the men been in their full strength? Verse 31. The Israelites struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash all the way to Ajalon. Since the Israelites were completely exhausted, they rushed to the plunder, took sheep, cattle, calves, slaughtered them on the ground, and ate the meat with the blood still in it. Some reported to Saul, look, the troops are sinning against the Lord by eating meat with the blood that was still in it. Now this, of course, was Saul's foolish command, that they were so hungry that they just started tearing into dead animals. Okay. Saul said, you have been unfaithful. Roll a large stone over here at once. He said to them, go among the troops and say to each of them, each man must bring me his ox and his sheep. Do the slaughtering here, and then you can eat it. Don't sin against the Lord by eating meat with the blood in it. So every one of the troops brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had built an altar to the Lord. Okay. Verse 36. Saul said, let us go down to the Philistines tonight and plunder them until morning, and don't let even one remain. Do whatever you want, the troops replied. But the priest said, we must consult God here. So Saul inquired of the Lord, should I go after the Philistines? Will you hand them over to Israel? But God did not answer him that day. Now, keep this in mind, because Saul would become kind of aware or used to God not answering him. Verse 37. So Saul inquired of God, shall I go to the Philistines, or will you hand them over to us? But God did not answer him that day. Saul said, All you leaders of the troops, come here, let us investigate how this sin hath occurred today. As surely as the Lord lives, who saved Israel out of it, because of my son Jonathan, he must die. No one of the troops answered him. So he said to all of Israel, you will be on my side, and I and my son Jonathan will be on the other side. And the troops replied, do whatever you want. Now they're kind of like, just okay, do whatever you want. They don't want to speak against the king. Verse 41. So Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, give us the right decision. So Jonathan and Saul were selected, and the troops were cleared of the charge. Then Saul said, cast lot between me and my son, and Jonathan was selected. Saul commanded him, tell me what you did. Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the end of the staff that I was carrying. I am ready to die. And Saul declared, may God punish me and do so more severely if you do not die, Jonathan. So Saul was just he was just a character here. But the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die who has accomplished such great deliverance for Israel? No, as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, for he worked with God's help today. So the people redeemed Jonathan, and he did not die. Then Saul gave up the pursuit of the Philistines, and the Philistines returned to their own territory. And when Saul assumed kingship over Israel, he fought against his enemies in every direction, even against Moab, the Amorites, Edom, and the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he caused chaos. He fought bravely, defeated the Amalekites, and delivered Israel from the hand of those who plundered them. Now remember that Amalekites for later. Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchijah. The names of his two daughters were Merab, his firstborn, and Michael, the younger. Now we will come to know her later. She became David's wife. The name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimada. Okay, I'm sorry, I know I'm butchering these names. The name of the commander of his army was Abner, son of Saul's uncle Ner. Saul's father was Kirsch. Abner's father was Ner, son of Abram. The conflict with the Philistines was fierce all the days of Saul's. So whenever Saul noticed any strong or brave men, he enlisted them. The same thing that Samuel said would happen. So we see his family right here. That said, Michal, I think that's her name, will become David's son. We're going to see this just in a couple of chapters here. All right, guys, we're way over time. I will see you in chapter 15 in the next study. All right.